you brought jokes.
Just in case things go down.
No, they shouldn't. It should be good. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hot Topics panel. I'm pleased to have joining me Yvette Jackson. Yvette has over 27 years of experience with HUD and is currently the underwriting branch chief in Baltimore. She serves as the chairperson of the Northeast Regional Loan Committee. Prior to being the underwriting branch chief, Yvette served as multifamily production chief, construction manager, and construction analyst. I also have Joe McNeely from the Boston HUD office. He's the underwriting branch chief there. During his tenure in Boston, his team has issued 251 commitments totaling $5.1 billion, and that's only since 2016. So way to go, Joe. He's been involved in community development and environmental infrastructure for over 30 years. And last but not least, we have Sheila Galicki from Boston. Sheila is the technical branch chief, and she has over 25 years in both public and private sector commercial finance experience, specializing in multifamily and healthcare FHA financing. She also has experience in market analysis and new construction development. So as you guys can see from my lead slide, we were supposed to have Stacy Ashmore and Dan Schachter here from New York, but they were unable to join us. So I really want to thank Joe and Sheila for literally stepping in the last minute, and Yvette for being here as well. So thanks so much. So today we're going to talk about some hot topics in the Northeast, and the plan is to have the panel to be as interactive as possible. I didn't want to present you guys with a bunch of slides with thousands and thousands of words on them, so we really want to make this interactive, and I'd like to encourage you guys to ask questions during each topic, and you can either raise your hand and we'll have some microphone runners, or you can ask a question in the app. So please feel free to ask questions whenever, and we'll also have questions at the end. So we're going to start off with what happens when you submit your application. So once the Northeast gets their application, it goes into what we call intake. So Joe, what's the first thing that happens in intake and the early warning system that you're using? Can you please walk us through that?
Sure. So first, I have a breaking news. We are asking the lenders to contact our intake mailbox to say that you have established a drop box and that we want that to be delivered through the intake mailbox so that we know where to go to get your application. And once we do receive that application, we have a couple of steps right off the bat. We will update DAP, we will go into the application, check for completeness, and then walk through several reviews on different tabs in the application to make sure everything is there. And part of our response in the intake is that there's a requirement from the IG that we determine how we are assigning the work for the technical staff, are not assigning it to this technical staff, and it goes directly to single underwriting. And so we have a document that actually Sheila created that helps us walk through that very quickly, taking data out of the application, putting it into a grid that we can work our way through, and it provides us with answers on how difficult the application will be to work through and how it should be assigned to the underwriter and the tech team.
Great, thanks, Joe. And what would you say is your biggest frustration with the apps you guys are receiving right now?
So there's several fronts on this, but the main thing is we get frustrated when we're doing more of the quality assurance review for the lender in the application review as we start to go through it, finding missing documents, information that wasn't updated, inconsistencies across the different forms that you can tell the frustration by the number of emails you're receiving from the underwriter or from the tech person assigned to it, asking for clarifications on a number of different items that we find to be something that should be complete, and that's one of our biggest frustrations.
Great, thanks. Yvette, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay. All right, so we're going to do our second poll of the day. And just you guys, if anyone in the back ever can't hear us, if you could just put a thumbs up or something so we know to increase the microphone volume, because we want to make sure everybody hears, okay? Thanks. So the first poll is going to be, out of the 40 most recent applications received in the Northeast, what's the most common thing holding up application acceptance? So if you guys could go into your app and go to the live poll at the bottom and do your vote. Your choices are the CNA e-tool is missing, not having heroes done, missing loan amount, and too many typos. So I'm going to give it a minute and let you guys all vote. So hopefully everybody's voting. All right, let's see what we got. Oops, did I go the wrong one? All right, so it looks like you guys think the CNA e-tool missing is the biggest problem. Joe, what is it?
It's part of the problem. So what we learned is that the heroes, the e-tool, and the application comes from 3 different places and not at the same time. So what really kicks off our review in the intake is when we receive the application in our mailbox. We'll go in and we'll look to see if it's complete, if hero's been submitted, and the e-tool has been submitted. And so many times we're finding that the applications come in before both of those other items have come in, which means we're asking where is the e-tool and where is the heroes. So just a good practice you might want to employ is check with your consultants on the submission of the e-tool and the heroes, then send your application. That way we won't be pestering you for questions on where these things are. But in the e-tool itself, we have more problems in there because of the lack of information that's being delivered. It's been described as incomplete if there's no narrative from your PCNA, if you're not putting in the right amount of months or time to complete your repair work. We're looking for accessibility issue information to assert that it's going to meet 100% compliance. And if it's not, there has to be a lot of information provided on why it won't and where we have to draw the line on making it as close to 100% compliant as possible. So a lot of these issues come into play right off the bat when we're looking at an application and can stall it out. And sometimes it has stalled it out for weeks after you thought you submitted everything.
Great, thanks, Joe. And one of the things that Dan had mentioned, who's the underwriting branch chief in New York, is he told me that, Susan, the biggest thing that is missing in a lot of the apps that he's seen is not having heroes done. So please, please, please make sure you have heroes. Charlie?
Question, so when should heroes be submitted? Should it be submitted prior to the underwriter being assigned?
You're talking about heroes?
Right, heroes.
It should be submitted when the application, I would say just prior to the lender submitting the application.
Who should we assign it to?
Oh, okay, so yeah, that's been a problem because you have to pick someone, and we were asking people to assign it to Wendy Santiago, but I think we're going to change that to the new intake person. His name is Danielle Syed. But I think what we'll have to do is get information out to you on how that should work. Because yes, it does. I think it becomes insubmissible if you don't assign it to someone. So good point. Thank you, Charlie.
We good?
That
there's a
was
question.
the point that I was going to make, that we've had delays with getting HEROES completed because we needed the HUD underwriter to assign the NEPA to our third party, and we hadn't submitted the application yet, correct? So that was an issue for us as well, as getting somebody to actually make that, the underwriter to actually assign the NEPA to the project when the app hadn't been submitted.
Well, we discovered that we can self-assign HEROES to ourselves. So we will ask the underwriter to go into HEROES, or if they're not doing it, then there might be an appraiser that's picked it up because of the depth of the review in the environmental side, and they will be able to assign it to themselves. If not, the branch chief can assign it. It shouldn't be a delay any longer.
Right, and Joe, once you provide us with the name, then we can post it on the ELA website and distribute it.
Right.
Oh, so we are going to stick with Wendy Santiago.
So Stacy is watching on the live stream, and she's apparently giving Sheila information as we go.
That's
So.
why my phone's going off.
Okay. Yvette, I have a question for you. How is it determined which underwriter is being assigned once it gets through intake?
That is simply a matter of first in, first out. And that's first in, first out based on passing intake, not actually when the application was received.
Okay, great. And then how is it determined which underwriter is assigned?
So there are 3 different underwriter branch teams within the region, one in Baltimore, one in Boston, and one in New York. And we base that upon underwriter capacity and workload. We have weekly meetings, we have pipeline reviews, and we take a look at where the underwriters might be in terms of their processing, who might be next up. But we also take a look at the underwriter experience, the complexity of the deal. We try to, for the most part, match the location of the deal, the jurisdiction, along with where the underwriter is located. But that's not always possible, but we try to do that. Also, if it's 2-stage processing, if an underwriter had the deal at pre-app, we try to also make that same assignment to that underwriter for the firm commitment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yvette. Joe, can you talk to us a little bit about applications that are being submitted to HUD by lenders that aren't ready because they're essentially trying to jump the line and get in front of other packages from lenders who actually have submitted a complete deal?
Well, we found that the biggest culprit in this area is submitting an application either at the same time you start your HAP renewal or before you start your HAP renewal process. And those 2 items, those 2 reviews, they intersect, so they're not parallel processes. At some point, the HAP renewal tells the underwriter what the rents are and what are accepted, and then we're able to underwrite based on the rent comp study. But if we don't have that information accepted early into the process, then we're stalled out waiting for that HAP renewal to go through the state administrator, back to the owner, back to asset management for review and acceptance, and then the contract goes out through the state administrator to the owner. So it's a long, convoluted process, and it takes 120 days on average, and you're asking us to review an application that may only take 45 days for our review. So it does cause a delay, and it's something that can be avoided. And it's one of the first things that we ask about in our affordable projects, to make sure the lender knows that this is a process that needs to start early.
Great, thanks, Joe. And I do know that one of the things that Dan Schachter had mentioned to me, where lenders are technically jumping the line, is on environmental issues. So if you have an environmental issue that needs some additional testing, what's happening is that lenders are submitting their apps and telling HUD, oh, well, we're going to have our environmental results later, and that's kind of another big no-no. Joe, I don't know if you've had that happen with you, but that was a big issue for Dan.
Well, the three main areas are if you have lead-based paint or asbestos and it hasn't been tested for a long period of time and we're formulating an application, that's one thing that you should have tested, because an updated review will solve a lot of issues. And if it's not tested, we have to go through a waiver process. The other thing is, if you haven't started the 8-step process or the modified process, and we're not able to pick it up on our end, then that will cause a delay in our environmental review as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And I did want to mention that included in your app and also will be on the ELA website is we have a handout, because we're green this year, and that's where to submit your concept package. There's a handout for that, where you go to request an FHA number, and information on where to send in your application. So hopefully those documents are in your app, but they will be posted on the ELA website after the conference. Okay, we all hate rejections. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and it doesn't really sound like the Northeast rejects too many applications, but Yvette, can you talk about some of the things that would cause a rejection of the lender's application?
Sure, and you're right, Susan. We really don't reject too many applications. Some of the things Joe just spoke about, environmental issues tend to be some of the main reasons why we might reject an application. And even if it's not a hard reject, those applications tend to stay in the queue for sometimes 6 months or more, just trying to resolve environmental issues. He was talking about radon, wetlands, 8-step, but we also see them in the pipeline a long time also for 106 historic reviews. Tied up a long time to get those approved. And sometimes, even though we've kind of kept them and nursed them along, we've kind of toyed with whether or not we should have actually just rejected them until all of that was resolved. Other things that we see rejections, unsupported market demand, unsupported rents, or issues with the key principles.
Okay, great. Charlie?
Joe, just going back to a comment that you made earlier relating to asbestos and lead-based paint testing, what exactly did you mean by that? If the property's still actively managing the lead and asbestos with an O&M plan, what do you mean by long time frame and the need for retesting?
So the most recent test of an application we just received was in 2011. And it's a family property that had some asbestos tiling. And so what we needed to do was use over a long period of time could have caused damage to that asbestos tiling, and it needed to be looked at to determine whether or not anything had been broken or become friable. So what we're looking at is 9 years of use without any review other than the O&M plan in place protecting it.
And I know that when environmental analysts go out to the site, or PCNA providers, they do look for and comment, generally speaking. Is that sufficient, or do you need actual testing specifically for that?
There are several tests, and one that's very reliable is a test that will pick up air fragments in the air, an air quality test, and that will tell whether or not there's if the damaged tile is emitting any kind of fragments in the air. And you can look at it, they can test it, they can poke it, they can do all kinds of different views on what the material is that they're looking at. But the idea is that we need someone to basically say that they're an asbestos expert or a lead paint expert, and that they have reviewed it and found that the O&M plan is sufficient and we can continue with it. Most of the time that's what happens, but we have run into a few situations where the exterior of buildings have had damage to their asbestos material, and it had to be replaced. without the owner expecting that to happen.
And what do you mean by long time? Do you mean 5 years, 10 years? What's the?
I don't know if there's an exact standard. We thought 9 years was a long time. That's the life of a 223F. Most of them come in for less than 10 years for refinancing. So if we're looking at something that's been out there that long that hasn't been tested, we think it's prudent to have a hard look at it. And I don't know, we can go back to our experts and come up with what's expected, because I don't know all the rules behind all of these environmental controls, but there must be something in the language of the lead-based paint or the asbestos that says how long a test should be utilized before the next one has to be done. And we'll figure that out.
Sheila, did you want to add something?
Yes, I think one of the issues we've had recently that could have actually been avoided was, we read these reports and the language used. It will say, could be, it is inconclusive, or they use the word friable, non-encapsulated, friable. So actually the information, we rely on your report, right? The information that came to us stated there was a problem. That should have been read. We need those things to be vetted out before they come to us, because say, oh, it was a mistake. And that's fine if it's a mistake, but it still makes us have to have you have a professional clarify that indeed it was an error or a misstatement within your report. So I just think it's extremely important that these be vetted out to make sure the information that is being submitted to HUD is the information that is accurate for your transaction.
Great, thanks. So Yvette, you wanted to talk about an A7 that you rejected. I didn't think that ever happened. So tell us about that deal.
Well, it shouldn't happen, but rather than focus on the rejection, I think I'll focus on what would be best practices for an A7 submission. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Okay. With A7s, they do not go through an intake process as the other applications do. So here, due diligence is going to be key. So when the underwriter is getting the application, 30-day processing time, we want to be able to get through those very, very quickly. And I say 30 days, it's 30 calendar days, and you back out 4 weekends there, so there's 8 days gone. So really it's 22 days, and that's long as you don't have any federal holidays that could take it down to 20 or something. So it's really a short processing time frame. We have it in the portfolio already. It should be very straightforward. So here, really, it is a matter of how the application is presented. We heard that in the previous panel. We really need to get a good, solid submission. We don't have a standard submission requirement with the formatting on A7, so it's really key that the information is provided in the lender narrative, that it's clear, that you've done your due diligence, that you've reconciled the information in the third-party reports, so that if there's any issues that are brought out there, it is also captured in the lender narrative. I would say that the borrower and the lender also may be speaking with asset management up front before an application is prepared, would also be a good idea. In some cases, it may be that they may advise that an A7 may not actually be the most appropriate thing for the project at the time. They may think it might require something a little more based on the overall condition of the property. So I would advise talking to the account executive as well as pulling in the account executive branch chief or the director as appropriate to get the best information on that. Site visits. Although Chapter 18 of the MAP Guide says that site visits may not be required, it is actually just prudent to visit the site when you're submitting an application. It could be things that you would find at the site that you would only know by visiting it. And once you visit the site, then the application should give the name of the underwriter who went to the site as well as the date that they visited. Information about, is it cash flowing? If it's not, if there's deferred maintenance, if there's any issues at the site, all of that should be captured not just in third-party reports. It should be actually prominently placed in the narrative as well. A side-by-side comparison of the savings on the property from the existing loan to the proposed loan. It's just very helpful for the underwriter here in that short processing time frame to have this information at their fingertips. An accurate assessment of the property condition. If there is something significant at the property, here again, please don't just have it in the third-party report or the CNA. Make sure that you are capturing it and giving a plan for addressing the issue at the site. These should be a very quick turnaround. With a good submission, there should be no issues or problems, and certainly no rejections.
Great, thanks. And I would imagine with the interest rate environment that we're seeing right now that you guys are going to be inundated with A7. So I hope you guys paid close attention. Charlie?
What's the processing time for A7s?
So it says it's 30 calendar days. Back out 4 weekends. So now you're at 22 days, okay? So really we have been meeting those time frames on our A7s. It's only when the application is not as good as it could be that it could actually add some time to it. But really, we don't see A7s too much even going into a preliminary reject status. Those are mostly done on time.
Great, thanks. Sheila, have you had any rejections in Boston that you want to talk about?
Well, it wouldn't be talking about Boston. It would be a Northeast application because everything we do is work share. But thankfully, we don't really have that many. It's a very difficult process to reject an application. So I think that they try to offer the most flexibility as possible. I do think that a common theme would be for a deal that was rejected, not returned, but actually rejected, would be when you have really unique pieces of your application that maybe we should have vetted at the pre-con meeting, not pre-con, on a concept meeting. So this would be a property that's, you think Section 8, awesome. It was a scattered site all over a very interesting area. And the property was very tired, very tired. So when we see, just looking at your first page of your narrative, we see built in 1960. When was it last updated? Never. And we're not going to do any maintenance on it. We don't have to do anything. Now this is a city property that has built in 1960. So we obviously probably have some 504 issues we have to attend to. The money was put into, the presentation was to put all of the funds, huge deposit in year 2. Now that sounds great, but the issue we have is if you have a property that you haven't updated in 40 years, what assurances can we have that if we release all this money, that it's ever going to happen, right? So therefore, it is best to get this property back into shape because we need to have a property that's safe for people to live in. And actually, I guess what we could do is give it a amortization of 10 years. That wouldn't be a very good loan, right? But we want to make sure that the deals we're doing have a useful life that matches the term of the loan. And not doing any deferred maintenance on a 40-year transaction, a transaction that's 40 years old for multifamily affordable housing is a very tough sell. And I think we would be, it would be beneficial to any sort of, either the originator who's selling the transaction to advise the client they're going to have to shine up this penny a little bit before they bring it into HUD. That is just something we couldn't work with. Unfortunately, we did have to return it. I think what they were aiming for was avoidance of D4 transaction. Maybe it wasn't, but unfortunately we couldn't move forward with that transaction, but we're always looking to maybe give it another run if we can get those deferred maintenance items confirmed.
Charlie?
Yvette, question for you, just on the A7 transactions, are you reviewing heroes or any modified heroes? What are you looking for on heroes?
Yes, Heroes is still required for A7s, but it's very, very limited. Okay, so you're looking at the maps, and it's another component that the underwriter most times initiates. It's always helpful, though, if it's initiated from the outside. That also facilitates the process, but if it's not there, the underwriter will initiate that process. But that doesn't take long at all.
Great. Yvette, I want to go back to something that you mentioned when you were talking about kind of common themes of rejection, and you had mentioned key principles. Now, are you talking about lack of experience with a key principle? Because, I mean, obviously that's something that could be mitigated with joint venturing or partnering. So what are you talking about when you say key principles?
That is true. If it's experience, you can bring in an experienced borrower or a moneyed partner or whatever might be required there. Make sure that you're checking for flags on the borrower. Also doing a case search as necessary, or just doing a Google search as necessary. If you find anything out there in terms of convictions, anything where they were in the news, negative press, that sort of thing, it's not necessarily that it might be a deal breaker, but you need to make sure that you are calling that to our attention in the lender narrative and talking about how the borrower has overcome those challenges and how it is still an acceptable risk for us. One of the things that we looked at on a particular deal was a rejection was reputational risk. And so when you get into convictions, especially something that has really been in the news, we're concerned that, if the property even still moves forward, that we still would be associated with that negative press.
That's a great point. So I guess the lesson is if you guys don't Google your borrower, HUD's going to, and you don't want them finding something that you haven't found. So Joe, from my conversations with Stacy, it sounds like you guys are missing information from third parties. And it's happening probably more than it should. So I want to ask everybody, if you pull out your apps, do you guys think that HUD should call third parties to obtain missing information from the application? So just take a minute and vote. All right. Okay, so we got a couple of yeses here. So, Joe, what's going on?
Well, I think the best practice is for the lender to talk to the underwriter and the lender talk to their specialists and the underwriter talk to the specialist on the HUD side. There are occasions where it gets deep and involved, and it's best to have a monitored conversation directly between a specialist from each side. But that's usually when you get really deep into the weeds. Most of the time, we're really looking for updates on information that might be stale or information that's missing that the lender can track down. So we're not generally having our team call directly to an underwriter, and I think we'd like to know if that's something that does happen. I heard an emphatic no over here when the question was posed, and it is the standard to keep the conversation and the communication between the lender and the underwriter.
Great, thanks. Okay, you guys, it's not fair for you to answer a poll question after you know the answer. So, all right, we're going to move on to everyone's favorite topic, the CNA. So included in your app and on the ELA website, you guys will find a list of pretty much everything that is required to be attached to the CNA. But we all know Sheila is the CNA guru. So I'm gonna ask her a few questions. So I'd like you to please tell me about one or two things that tend to be missing when you get a CNA.
One note, that's not my list. So, what is missing? Okay, the first thing is there's this notice that just came out And it's not a real notice, it's just best practices. And it does have what is an attachment. I think one thing that is a bit misunderstood about the CNA e-tool is that it's a file cabinet, and the lender has a big part of completing the CNA e-tool. Okay, it isn't just your third party filling in the repairs, and you're supposed to have a lot of attachments. I would say one of the biggest issues we have would have to be, first of all, you start off with, there's a drop, we don't go through your CNA e-tool, first of all. That's the first thing people think, oh, they're underwriting the CNA tool. We open it and look for a couple items. Did you complete the flags? Example, I'll have a flag that say, this one caught on fire, so we're gonna replace it, one panel. I'm like, well, why don't we, but there's 300 more in the property. So what about those ones? They didn't answer a flag, or they said, it looked good to us. I've gotten that before. So if your flags are not answered, or you do not give a response to what the CNA e-provider has given as a flag, that is an issue why we would respond. That's bottom. Ours is completeness. Secondly, if you do have a property that's Section 8 or of a certain age, you have to follow the 504 UFAS. So if your property is Section 8 and you do not, and it is not UFAS compliant, that is a civil rights violation. So therefore, you have to meet that requirement, and it has nothing to do with FHA financing. It has to do with your Section 8 contract. Okay, so it isn't, oh boy, I don't want FHA financing because then they're going to make me redo my property. It actually has to do with your contract. So if you point that out to your client, I think that will be helpful. So anyway, you do have to have compliance, and sometimes it isn't feasible to do because we're not going to make you tear your whole building apart, such as taking down a load-bearing wall. That would not be a feasible solution. But if you just have to, maybe, I got one time that they said it was not feasible to do, it was a closet. It wasn't a load-bearing wall. It was just something that needed to be done. So what you have to do is follow your map guide and the appendix, and it shows you how to facilitate your CAP plan. Your CAP plan is your list of repairs. This is the second section. And then there's things that go along with that, such as if you are going to ask for it to be deferred, or if you're going to ask for saying it's absolutely infeasible, then you would have to have support from a professional, right? Your architect, or and then they would have to tell us why you couldn't do this, why it is not feasible. Or you can say we'd like to defer it, and this is how it is feasible. They'll give us a plan as to how they will complete the repair. Okay, so that can be done in the region. Stacy can sign those if, you just have to follow the map guide. That's all we asked. It isn't our way, it's just the map guide. After that, we often do not get any attachments besides a CNA e-tool, or someone attaches the whole PCNA report. We're trying to get away from that whole fat PCNA report, right? We want the meat of the sandwich, basically. So if you look at all your attachments, when you look at a 400-page PCNA report, the first 20 pages are what your PCNA provider gives you. That's their report. And then after that is a bunch of attachments. You'd never submit a PCNA missing with only 20 pages, right? You'd say, HUD would send it right back to you. You need to make sure that you take those attachments and they are attached one by one to the CNA e-tool. So if you look at the list, I can't see the list as to what they're talking about, but if you look at the questions, what is it called, the best practices, they do have a very easy list. It's completeness tested. I strongly recommend that you take a very big part in your CNA e-tool. Lenders, they do have a big responsibility in it. It isn't like the old days where you got it, you threw it in the box with your application and off it goes. You have a part of it. You have to upload things. There are responsibilities that have to tie back to your application. So those are the things that are mainly missing. We'll get into the heavies later on. This is just a regular deal.
Sheila, just a quick question on that. So one of the attachments includes as-built plans. What about projects that are really old? They might not have the plans. Is that an absolute requirement?
Well, it depends, I would say. Say you need those plans in order to distinguish whether it can meet accessibility, right? That might be a reason why. I think it's very case-specific why we would want to see those, but I think that would be a case-by-case basis, Charlie.
The question is,
She's saying
those
they
things
don't fit.
Yep.
Well, if they... Well, we've had quite a bit of success on having those attachments. So maybe some deals are more voluminous than others. If they are, I would just recommend that you upload a page saying, see under separate cover and submit it with your application. We really, really much are trying to go paperless, and we do work virtually. Therefore, that is why we request, for instances like this with this virus, we can still move forward and work with this because everything is in one consolidated place. So that is really the why we're really trying to move in that direction.
And one thing that Dan wanted me to make sure I mentioned, so this is Dan Schachter in New York, is he said for him one of the biggest things missing is the actual CNA itself. And I said, you're kidding, right? And he said, no. So please, please, please include a CNA. So Sheila, what are some of the big no-nos regarding a CNA? I know one of the things Dan wanted to talk about was estimated useful life and negative useful life. So could you maybe touch on that a little bit?
Well, I just think if you're an underwriter, you review the document. If you review the document and you're going through, we try to go through this. First, we try to go through this. The guys only have 15 days. They have 15 days from the day I send it to them to the day they have to give a deliverable. And since 80 to 90% of our deals are heavy Fs, that is quite a task for these guys to do. And visit the site as well. So therefore, that's why we need this information to be so comprehensive. We can't stop and start. It has to be a flow. And we cannot condition things in a CNA e-tool either. We don't condition those. So,
about estimated useful life and negative useful life.
Just like myself, you look at it. If it says a 0 or a negative number as to what useful life is left, we're going to ask you to put that in a non-critical repair. If the useful life is gone, it's a deferred maintenance item. Obviously, some people would say, oh, but this one was just so well maintained that we absolutely do not have. This is definitely a 50-year boiler. That might be right. That's great. So you can give some support for that, and then obviously we would move forward with that. You know, we're not looking to find mistakes. All we're looking for is support for your determination. You make the decision. I wouldn't leave it up to us.
Charlie?
And just on the submitting the CNA with the e-tool, what you're looking for is just the narrative portion, not the complete CNA with all the attachments, correct?
I would have to confer with Dan what he's referring to. The CNA is actually within the body of the tool, so we'll go over that. But no, the attachments are, what is most important is name your attachments, give them a name. Don't separate your PCNA report by chapter and attach it. That's not what we're looking for. Make your narratives be a cliff notes for us. Point out things that are problematic, because it would be easier for it to be found immediately so we can address it instead of having it come up at the end. So I'm not really sure about that. We use the financial factors, and that actually is not a required attachment. That's in extraction. All your documents are extracted out of the CNA e-tool, so you should see your commitments all look exactly the same for your critical and non-critical repairs and insurance certificates.
Okay, Sheila, how can lenders cool down the hot mess of the reserve schedules?
review the schedule. I really have not encountered as much issue with that. We're really just focusing mainly with our type of product that is mainly in the Northeast region. Is first, we're just trying to get through this deferred maintenance issue. With the age of the properties, the inability to do additional construction, we are usually doing so much in the deferred maintenance arena, the non-critical repair, that, I mean, to continue these properties, to maintain them based on their useful life, these schedules have to be pretty well developed, because that's how you're going to get your money from your asset manager. Your asset managers are now using these replacement reserve skills to release your money. So you don't want to put everything out. If you plan on doing something in year 3, don't put it in year 5. It will just complicate things. We want to make things easier for clients. We want this program to be more user-friendly, to educate the client as to making sure they get paid on time, making sure they're able to access their funds. And how you can do that is by properly vetting and properly educating your client as to how the replacement reserve works.
So it sounds like making sure that you have money in the years when you actually need it, rather than trying to front load it or back load, but just if you know you're going to do something, put it in that year, I think is maybe the takeaway here. And so Sheila, one more question. When you guys are reviewing the tool, are there anything that HUD really focuses on that they really, really take seriously in terms of replacements?
Anything to do with life and safety, obviously. Accessibility, if you do, that is extremely important for us as well. Beyond that, I would just say, we want to make sure that when you send us an application, if you say that it's a Ferrari, we don't want a Pinto. We want a property that's going to live through the useful life. If we do unfortunately need to foreclose, that we can recapture our risk, that we're underwriting a proper risk associated with the property. So I just think to document, make sure you have support and backup for your underwriting conclusions. And I don't think we are looking for a reasonable product. So I just think in the long run, these are tough conversations you may have to have with an owner to say, you know what, that's just not going to work. I think you would be better suited to get through the 45-day process if you had those conversations before you handed it in and delivered it to us, as to during the process.
And Sheila, I would think that heat and hot water is another hot thing that you would want to make sure.
Yes, and you have to have working bathrooms. That's you think these are kind of, basic items. If you have an elderly building, let's make sure that we have some elevators that work, and make sure if they are older that they are up to code, and also that you have working records and maintenance records for the elevator. We do go sometimes to a property and the elevator is not working, and that can be extremely problematic. One item that I just had yesterday that I was reviewing, it's down on, way down in the narrative, it stated, the elevator's broken, but we're going to get the parts shortly after closing. I'm like, well, no, we're not. We need to make sure that we have working elevators so the folks can get up to their apartments. You also want to make sure your life and safety items are in very good working order.
Great. Thanks, Sheila. All right, I know this is a really, really hot topic for a lot of lenders out there, is cash. And I know a lot of lenders, Joe, have questions about the $1 million holdback on the cash outs. So can you tell us what the policy is going to be in the Northeast going forward? Because Stacy did want me to acknowledge that the Northeast was requiring $1 million no matter what, and they're not going to be doing that anymore. So Joe, can you tell us about the policy?
Well, we did get some feedback on our $1 million holdback policy, and we are making changes to it. So in the Northeast region, we have a large number of heavy Fs, but we also have a large number of properties that exceed 200 units. And if you have a a property that's 250 units and it has $8,000 per unit, you're pushing $2 million in reserve. And that reserve becomes a clumsy process to deal with after the loan closes. So we had put the $1 million requirement in front of all of our Fs because we were dealing with some issues. But we've changed our position. We're going to continue to look at the heavy Fs and put a holdback in place in those for the $1 million because we're talking about $15,000 per unit. That could be tens of millions of dollars that are out there in a reserve that have to be done in a year. And then we have to go back to looking at the owner's experience and work back from there. If there has been a good track record on doing repairs and there's no deferred maintenance in the deal, and we check with the account executive to make sure that they have a good experience working with the owner on doing the initial repairs based on the reserve for replacement. Then we can go to a lower holdback, and I'm not exactly sure what the analysis will be for that, but we are not going to hold the $1 million holdback in place for what we consider a simple F, working with a good owner. That's something that we can be sure of. I know this is going to raise some questions because we haven't completely formulated our approach to this, but we're trying to back away from our position on all Fs being treated with $1 million holdback.
So it sounds like you're going to look at deals on a case-by-case basis rather than just the whole blanket $1 million, right?
Right. The MAP guide requires us to look at it on a case-by-case basis because there are factors involved on every property that aren't the same across the whole platform. So we're dealing with owners, we're dealing with property managers that work differently even in their own portfolio. They have tendencies to treat different properties differently than others in their portfolio. So we rely on a good discussion with our asset management team to come to grips with what we should be doing with those repair holdbacks.
Okay, and what about if you're dealing with a new owner versus an owner that you know? Are you guys taking that into consideration as well?
That is, so the track record, if it doesn't, there has to be a track record. If it doesn't exist, then it puts us in a position of, I would say, going out on a limb on a perceived reputation of an owner based on what we would like to have as a fully vetted understanding of what an owner is doing. And we can do that through our asset management review and look at previous deals that we've done with owners that have been in the program and see how they've worked through their non-critical repairs work in the past. But with a new owner, it's hard. We just don't have that information, and there's got to be an understanding that we are willing to work with a new owner, but there has to be some measure of acceptance that we are willing to issue a firm and let them do repairs, but they have to give us some really good justification to go below that $1 million holdback. And we see the problem. You know, if there's $75,000 worth of repairs on a 200-unit building and it doesn't amount to, barely, a few $100s per unit, we'd have some flexibility there. But when we get up to these larger ones where we're talking $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 per unit, and that's pushing a multi-million-dollar non-critical repair that has to be done in a year, and we don't have a track record, we have to have something to hold up and say, this is what the end game is. We'll hold up this $1 million until you complete those repairs. And we think that that's a fair position to take.
So it sounds like you really want to give these borrowers an incentive to actually get their repairs done, right?
It's vitally important, because if they're not done in a year, then they're violating the firm, the regulatory agreement, and it calls into play notices of default. And so we don't want to be there in a year after signing a 35 or 40-year loan.
Right. Okay. And I have one last question. When would a lender need to submit a waiver on the cashback?
Well, the best time to submit all waivers is when you submit your application, because those waivers go through an approval process. So as soon as we know what you're asking to waive, the sooner we can get that waiver process through for approval. Some waivers have to go to headquarters and need a longer lead time. Others we can do in the region, and there's an abundance of waivers that float through the administration in the region on a daily basis. And we don't have a logjam, so we do move them, and they are done timely, but we don't want it to be the last thing we do when we're issuing the firm. It's something that needs to be known and understood and agreed upon right as we get started into the application review.
Okay, great.
It's definitely not anything we want to do the closing coordinator doing.
Yeah, after the firm's issued, sometimes we forget, and we have to look at that closely to see why we forgot to do a waiver and what the impact is. Because we don't ask for, do you want to waive this or you want to waive that? That's completely up to the lender to tell us what they want to waive in either the closing guide or the map guide, or even out there in our renewal guide.
Okay, great. Okay, let's talk about heavy Fs, and I'm gonna try to go through this a little quickly because we have a couple more important topics, and I think we're running out of time. So I know there's a panel Friday morning at 9:30 talking about the administration F, so we're not going to get into that. But Sheila, just a couple quick questions. One of the big questions I think lenders have is what happens when the repairs are close to hitting the sub-rehab threshold? How is HUD handling that?
That's not good. That's not good at all. I think you really have to make sure that these projects are being priced accordingly, not backed into how much you want to spend, or taking that the maximum amount is $41,000 asterisk, because I don't know exactly where you are is the number. So you don't want to say, okay, well, it might cost more, but that's okay because we'll just use your assurance. Well, your insurance has to be your assurance of completion. That money is actually there for if your client cannot complete the transaction, those funds will be used by you to finish it up. It's not used as a contingency. So I would recommend that when you're sizing these, you need to be realistic. You need to make sure that you are putting them in a good position. My understanding is if we do go over, the violations will go to LQMD, and they indeed will let you know what happens from there. But I do caution you that isn't anything that you want to play around with. Be conservative on that side.
All right, great. And you mentioned two things I want to touch on really quickly. So the assurance of completion escrow, you guys are doing so many of these heavy Fs, and some of them have pretty exorbitant assurance of completion escrows. And I know some of the questions that I've gotten is, during the repair process, is HUD willing to release the assurance of completion escrow as repairs are being completed because you have this big escrow? And if so, can lenders request it monthly, quarterly? How is HUD handling that?
Well, this is kind of a new phenomenon. I honestly, it would be very challenging to do this on a monthly basis. I would say this is something that we'd have to sidebar and discuss. You know, when you do say these are very large escrows, yes, they are, because we have deals that are $15 million in repairs needing to be done in 1 year. So yes, they are very voluminous, but it is 1 year. So again, it would have to be on a case-by-case basis, and this would have to be a matter we'd have to discuss further.
Okay. And so one last question, the need for a 2328, I know the new map guide says that 2328s are not required for heavy F, and I can just envision HUD getting 100 different forms from 100 different lenders. So how is HUD, and I might even look at you, Bob Iber, to answer this question, what is HUD going to do? Is there going to be a form that you're requiring on these heavy Fs, or how is that going to be handled?
The best practices memorandum does have I'm not sure who created it, I'm guessing David. It does have a form that it should be utilized for these heavy Fs. It does have all of the different segments of a transaction. 2328, you know, it's hard for us to get away from that because it is a form that we are familiar with. But we do not want to see overhead and builder profit in your CNA e-tool list of repairs. Okay, that's one thing I can definitely be clear about.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I was going to do a quick poll on whether you think contingency is required to be included. We're running out of time, so we're going to skip that. The answer is yes. You have to include your contingency in your total repairs per unit on a heavy F. The contingency. Okay. All right, so Q. Sounds like HUD doesn't like to use the word queue. They like to use the word intake. So how many deals, Joe, do you guys have an intake right now?
Well, that's put me on the spot. So in March, so far, I looked at the list. It's got to be 15 to 18 deals, and out of those, that number of applications that we received, 4 of them were moved to the what do we call it?
Work
Work
share.
share. Thank you. With the work share outside of the region, I believe they're being reviewed in Chicago, and I would say that there are 3 of them are on hold for intake issues to be resolved before we assign it to the underwriter.
Okay, and then how is that work share process going? Who oversees that?
So there's a committee of, I believe it's the division directors working with headquarters. There's a person assigned to this that looks at the work share requirement or need in each region, and they try to balance it on, if you can understand what work share is, one region may not have a full workload and another region is overloaded. So we want to move those applications into review rather than hold them waiting for the workload for underwriters in the region to open up. So it's something that we've done just recently. I would say in the last 4 years, we just started doing that in the last 6 months or so. And I can tell you one of the reasons why we are dealing with this issue is we're one of the regions where the closing coordinator does the closing work, which takes a tremendous amount of workload off of the underwriter's plate. And by doing that, we're able to recircle the underwriters back to new deals and even have them overlap the workload maximum, because we know that a deal is ending and getting a firm, and they can start it up immediately, and they're not trailing off into the closing process. And we've lost all but one of our closing coordinators and had to hand the work back to the underwriters to do the closing work on their applications that they issued firms on, and that's reduced our capacity. And we're starting to build that back up. We're hiring new closing coordinators, and we're going to get back to our initial strategy of having the closers do the closing work. And that's something that it just happened over the last year that we fell into that trap of having to have the underwriters do the work.
Okay, Charlie, did you have something?
So, Yvette, one question, A7s. So if somebody's requesting a waiver for having to submit a PCNA, what's the general time frame in order for HUD to potentially approve that waiver?
Well, it depends, Charlie. If you have a deal that you did 2 years ago, and probably more than that, and you now are coming in for the green, and your previous PCNA had nothing to do with green, and I'm talking about a 223F, then you would obviously need a new CNA that's going to have all those components. I do know that if you built a D4 with HUD financing and it was built maybe green certified or gold or whatever, LEED certified, then we have been able to move forward without requiring a new CNA e-tool. You just need to have the replacement reserve schedule. So if you're looking just to modify your transaction on 223F, and the report's only a little bit, it still meets our requirements, then we're pretty good there. But if you're looking to make any sort of adjustment, such as a new MIP, then you are going to need a CNA, a CNA report.
Regardless of the time frame? If you're going from non-green to green, then you need a CNA regardless of the time frame.
Because your report previously would not have supported that, except for the D4 that was LEED certified. That's another issue. I strongly recommend that you give a call ahead of time to discuss the matter.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to blow through this pretty quickly. So communication with asset management seems to be a little bit of an issue, and I wanted to talk about markup to market. Joe talked about that just a little bit with regard to getting that done early, but I guess one of the questions is, should lenders be sharing any owner reports with the appraiser, like the rent comparability study? Or are there any other things you want to touch on the markup to market?
So sharing information, it depends on who you're sharing it with. So if we have a third-party reviewer looking at the rent comp study through the waiver to allow to avoid the third-party review, well, that was kind of convoluted. That appraiser is going to want to see as much information as they can. And so they may be looking at the lender's and the owner's appraisal. I don't think they'll be going to the appraiser asking for that information. But between appraisers working for the lender and the owner, we don't think that that's a good idea. There has to be some distance so that it's factual. We don't want them seeking the result that the owner got with their appraisal. It should be independent. But when we're looking at it from the perspective of what the rent should be, we're looking like a 360-degree review on the HUD side to make sure we come up with the right rents. And that would entail an understanding of what the parameters were in each one of the appraisals. But one of the things that we have a problem with in this markup to market area is when you do opt to use the waiver for the HUD appraiser to do the third-party review, the appraisal that comes from the owner does not have the grids that are required in the renewal guide, and that can cause a slowdown in the review process of determining what the rent should be, because they have to fill out the required grid form for the rent comp study, and that means it has to go back to the appraiser and the owner's appraiser, and it has to be redone and resubmitted.
Okay, great. Yvette, with the 9839s, lenders are often scrambling to get those signed, 9839s at closing. How can HUD help with that?
Ideally, we should be trying to get those before we issue the firm commitment. I know it doesn't always happen, but we need to work more diligently with asset management to get those ahead of time so that we're not trying to scramble at closing.
And with the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan getting approved, it seems like it's taking quite a while to get comments from asset management so that they can vet everything. So one of the things that we've included in the app and on the website is a list of pretty much how to fill out the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan and what they're looking for so that you do it correctly and it'll get approved. So Yvette, I don't know if you just want to maybe quickly talk about the biggest issue.
Because we were having so many returned from, FHEO actually is ultimately the one who reviews and approves the plan. It's actually not asset management. Asset management just does an initial review along with the checklist to submit to FHEO. FHEO ultimately reviews and approves. Basically, they said that everyone just needs to make sure that they read the worksheet, read the instructions, because that's often things are missed. The form is incomplete, or they're incomplete worksheets, or they're actually missing attachments. Those are the top three. Specifically worksheets 1, 3, and 4, which is dealing with the demographics, dealing with the advertising, and dealing with communications with the community.
Great, thanks. And it sounds like there's one exception when you're not requiring the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan for a D4. What is that?
Yes, if it's a 221D4 sub-rehab, if the plan was completed within 5 years of the application submission, you do not have to submit a new plan. So what you would do in the application is submit a copy of the existing approved plan. But of course, with anything, there's conditions with that, okay? And so the condition would be, you skipped on me, Susan, now I lost my place.
I know, sorry.
So the conditions would be that there have been no updates to the local jurisdiction's consolidated plan. There's been no significant changes in the demographic in the housing market area, and the owner has not adopted a residency preference or admissions preference that hasn't been previously approved by HUD. And so you would just make sure when you include that in your application, you address those items.
Great. And then what about 223Fs? Do they or do they not require the marketing plan?
They are not required for market rate or affordable deals.
Okay, great, thanks. Waivers, really quickly, we're going to blow through this. Yvette, should waivers be included in all applications?
All applications, it should be included in the lender narrative as well as completion of the HUD-2 as well.
And do not request a waiver after you get a firm application.
Please do not.
Any words of wisdom when submitting waivers?
Joe actually touched on this, but I think that the earlier you communicate that you know about a waiver, the better. So even pre-concept meeting, if you will, if you know that you might need a waiver on something, that's the time to ask so that you can see how you should proceed when you submit your application. And hopefully we can get that approved as quickly as possible prior to issuing the firm commitment.
All right, and then what about a waiver? Is it needed to defer accessibility repairs?
No, a waiver is not needed to defer accessibility repairs. The MAP guide intention was just to make a distinction between critical repairs and critical accessibility repairs. But the idea is that those should be completed as soon as possible after endorsement. If it takes 3 months, then it should only take 3 months. Those should be completed as soon as possible, not waiting until the end of the 12-month period.
All right, and one last slide because Stacey will be really, really mad at me if I don't show this to you guys. So she wants to know if anyone in the room has any idea what point she was trying to make by this slide. Anybody want to take a stab? No. Anybody? So, Joe, what point did Stacey want to make on this?
Okay, we're going to talk about relocation. So there's the Uniform Relocation Act, and it requires a certain amount of review and approval. And I would say very seldom do we have to go to that stage in our repairs. And some substantial rehabs go there if they have other federal money involved from CPD. But that's usually the main reason why we have to invoke the Uniform Relocation Act. But then you have basic human decency. So you don't want people just shown the door and told to go get lost for the day and tell them to come back at 5 and they can have their apartment back. You want to be a lot more accommodating. And we found that if you hire a consultant to coordinate your relocation activities, no matter how small they are, if you have someone that's not working for the management agent that they can go to and feel at ease with to discuss the issues that they have with the relocation, it's a better product for the owner to have someone working on their behalf that's not on their staff. It puts the tenant at ease. And if you can envision, you're going to take the cabinets out of the kitchen and replace them in a day. And we were actually at a site recently where we were told that the tenants want to watch. So they want to hang out in their living room and watch all this activity because they think it's cool and it's better than going down to the recreation room and watch people play cards or watch television. And so they accommodate that. But the point is that people have all different kinds of notions that what they find to be relaxing and an appropriate way of dealing with this. If you have someone who is having their cabinets removed, that person has to have someone, if it's an elderly person, come in and take everything out of their cabinets for them, store them so that they can be put back afterwards. Well, that needs to be coordinated. And if it's coordinated in a way where you're told go down to the storage room and get boxes, you're going to have a perturbed tenant. But if you have it organized where the boxes show up and maybe there's a person that shows up with the boxes that can fill them for the tenant, then you have a happy tenant. And one of the things that you're going to deal with, our asset management people complain to us about this all the time, is relocation is really hard on the tenants because their lives are being disrupted. They don't want it, and they don't want to be forced to do things that they don't want to do. So it becomes a quagmire of angst and anxiety. So we ask you to hire a consultant, even if it's minimal relocation, because you will have a better process, and you won't end up with these issues like the tenant not letting the workers in the unit because they weren't aware, or they felt harmed or aggrieved in some way in the process through the lack of communication on what was supposed to happen. So that's the point of this slide. It's something, it's nuanced, it's not really in the realm of the lending practice, but it's one of those things that if you're putting money into that non-critical repair period, this is happening to the tenants. And you want the tenants to be advised and be fully warned what's going to happen and have the best communication possible. And so we're asking you to tip off your owners that this is a good practice and it would help them in the long run. In your relocation plan, you can put a budget. There's a budget. It's mortgageable, I believe, right? It's mortgageable cost. Say that again? Yeah.
So apparently the new map guide is clarifying that the cost for relocation with a consultant is mortgageable. So I think that's kind of the takeaway. So we're a little over, I'm sorry, but does anyone have any final questions before we wrap? Anybody? a lot of hot topics to talk about. So thank you guys for being here. Karen?
So, yeah, just want to, there's no break between this and the environmental panel coming up, so we're going to switch right to the panels. So no one needs to exit. You just all stay in your seats so we do a quick switcheroo here.
Thanks, everybody.
Give session feedback, so if you go into the app, I missed the reminder on the headquarters panel, so please go to the headquarters panel and this panel and give session, just, it's a really quick survey on the sessions. Thanks.
Hello. Oh, there we go. You all right, Bob? Hello. Hold it. Oh.
Okay.
Yes.
Very close. Hey, Jesse. Testing.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hello? Okay. Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Michelle Smee. I'm the Deputy Chief Underwriter at CBRE.
Testing.
We are the last panel of today. Thank you for joining us. This is the environmental overview, and we'll be talking about current as well as proposed changes to Chapter 9. So on the panel, we have Bruce Spidell, we have Jesse Pascoe from EBI Consulting, we have Felicia Hewlett from Renault and Kavanagh, and we also have Bob Burley, a HUD appraiser from Baltimore office. So thank you, Bob, for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge Kathy McNulty as well as Rick Shaw. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to join us, and they contributed an awful lot in the preparation of this, and so hopefully they're watching us on the live stream. So basically, this presentation is going to be about the proposed changes on the drafting table. We're going to look at the considerations of some of the current guidelines as well as what HUD's thinking was behind some of the revisions that they're proposing to implement. Okay, so Bob, we're going to go over to you on the first slide. This is, basically first of the 4 proposed updates that we wanted to talk about. Did you want to give us a quick thought from HUD's perspective on Heroes and lead-based paint?
Sure, Michelle. I'm actually substituting for Rick Shaw. I'm out of the Baltimore office, so you're looking at the second string here. So I'm not going to know every answer. If it's real important, I'll take the questions and your names and get back to you. As far as Heroes go, Heroes is not a whole lot to update that is, as nothing specifically is new. It is up and running and it's apparently working well. Heroes is a requirement. It's mandatory for lenders and ESA analysts to submit the ESA reports directly into Heroes. Regarding Part 50, it's recommended when assigned to the HUD reviewers from the vendor, this should be done in a more timely manner.
So I think basically what Rick was wanting to kind of say is that, obviously with the Heroes, we now have this kind of mandatory environmental agent assessor, working alongside, and there just needs to be a clearer communication as to when you've uploaded it so that HUD knows, and then they can kind of go backwards and forwards.
Okay, there is one other quick note that they have written here. There was a recent email blast from the Office of Residential Care Facilities, ORCF, confirming that environmental reviews that are prepared by third-party consultants in the HUD Environmental Review online system, Heroes, may now be voluntarily submitted to ORCF for Section 232 mortgage insurance applications online, like MAP, which is good news. Up until now, apparently they were doing just paper copies, so that's good news.
And then what about lead-based paint?
And lead-based paint, apparently not a whole lot to discuss. It's standard for refis for post-1960 and pre-1978 buildings, and with no disturbance to materials. The owner submits an O&M plan if there is. Typically, the project is there where the project is not doing heavy repairs or capital expenditure replacements. Then lead-based paint has been assessed in some capacity previously or tested and addressed. And now for radon, I think.
So before we do that, I think Rick was basically trying to say, in their experience, they're finding a lot of properties, that has lead-based paint typically has had some sort of prior investigation, and up to the lender and the environmental analyst to provide that information to HUD. And then that could be supported by an O&M plan. So it's just little prior thinking, prior preparation, nothing exceptional or unreasonable. So that was his point that he wanted to get across. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Jesse, do you want to give us a little update on the proposed radon?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for inviting us to be on the panel and sharing the new map guide, or draft map guide, that is. As most of you are aware, most people have been doing or completing 100% radon testing, ground floor testing for a while. The proposed new Chapter 9 eliminates the 25% standard deviation. So that's the biggest change for radon. And secondly, it also eliminates the waiver on Zone 3, low radon zones. So they're taking the approach that Lean did, where you're going to test regardless of the zone, and they're eliminating the 25% deviation. So it's not a significant change for Zones 1 and 2, but it is a significant change for Zone 3. I'm hoping they'll have a deviation from that, but we'll see. You know, maybe they'll back off of that and offer a lower, the 25% deviation for Zone 3, but we have yet.
Why do you think it's excessive, Jesse? I'm just throwing it out there now, putting you on the spot.
I think if you're in a state like Louisiana where the entire state's in a Zone 3, it's excessive to require 100% testing.
Okay.
I know that's the R standard, but I think you can allow the 25% deviation and still get a pretty good feel if there's a radon problem.
Anything about the O&M plans?
The other thing about the O&M plan is
Uh-oh, we can't hear you. The suspense is killing us all, I know.
Hello?
What is
Now it's
going on with the O&M plan?
So the other thing about the radon O&M plan, they did change when Is that better? Okay. So they did change the approach on the radon O&M plan and when it's required. Before, a lot of HUD offices were requiring that you prepare a radon O&M plan before you implement the mitigation system, which didn't make a lot of sense because you have to design the system first before you can design an O&M plan specific for that property. So now they've changed that, and now the O&M plan is done later, you know, after closing, so non-critical repair, which is a good thing because that way you don't have to do it twice.
You don't want
that's
to?
pretty much it for radon. I mean, that's, you know, they did clarify some things on the new construction side and who can certify projects. You know, before they kind of left it open to the architect, but now they still want a radon professional to review it, the design, and approve it.
Great, thanks, Jesse. All right, moving on to the next slide about the proposed asbestos updates. Do you want to
That's
give
me.
us? Okay, sorry, Bob.
Okay, with this one here, I actually had to call Rick Shaw to explain to me some of those acronyms, PLM, TEM, and NOB. And what they're trying to do here with the proposed asbestos update is to try and make things a little bit simpler and to perhaps save some money. What's going on right now is the HUD traditionally has been requiring the ASTM level of requirements, which gets involved with PLM, which is polarized light microscopy. TEM is electromagnetic microscopy, something like that. For NOB, which is non-friable materials, good example would be floor tiles. Apparently, when you get into the TEM stuff, it becomes expensive, and each test is around $1,500. What the attempt is being made to get this more in line with what various states do, and this is still proposed, but they're just trying to straighten it out, make it a little bit simpler, and that's what that is all about. And also they're trying to get the threshold rate was based on 1978 standards, and apparently what the department is going to be happier with a 1989 standard, which may cause some issues, but right now that's all proposed. And I think Jesse's going to tell us more about the added language.
Oh, so currently it's removed. The proposed changes are they're going to remove the date. And so, Jesse, you had some grievances about that. Share them with us.
Yeah, I believe the whole entire industry will have a lot of feedback on that one. I'll be surprised if that's not a comment from every lender in the room. Having no cutoff date is rather excessive, especially on the refi side. I understand it on the sub-rehab side where you're disturbing materials. There can be asbestos even today. So I can understand if HUD wants to keep the no date cutoff for sub-rehab or projects that are doing moderate rehab. But on refinances, that's excessive. You got to have some kind of cutoff date, maybe adopt the Freddie date of 1989, which is still, 11
So
years
that-
late after what you have
That's just a
now.
suggestion, isn't it? I mean, it works for Freddie, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it works well, and it's, most of those projects in 1989 don't have any asbestos, but you still have to do an O&M for projects built in the 80s, because there were still materials that were installed in properties, even though you had the 78 ban. So hopefully HUD will be, open to a change for the refi side, because I think that would make it a lot easier to swallow the cutoff date. And then I do like the approach they took of the lien, where you have different stages of asbestos remaining in place versus full removal. Previously it used to be friable materials had to be removed regardless. So now they've taken the approach that lien did, where you have different levels and conditions of asbestos. Some can remain in place, some do have to be removed. So that was a positive.
Great, thanks, Jesse. And before I move on to the next slide, Bob, those acronyms, I am going to be testing you on them, on PLM, TEM, and NOB at the end of the cocktail reception, okay? So just...
Great. I'm looking
I'll
forward
report
to
back.
it.
Okay, so we're going to discuss 3 other proposed changes in Chapter 9. We're going to talk about what is in the current map guide and then compare it to what's being proposed. Kathy McNulty really wanted to make it very clear, what we're talking about is proposed changes, because obviously they're not yet implemented, and she thought it was important to consider what is also in the current map guide so that we can have an exchange of conversation to say what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so Felicia, over to you. What are your thoughts?
So first of all, in terms of the new chapter and the proposed new language in the chapter, there really isn't anything new with respect to the levels of review. They currently exist, but now we're taking all the mortgagee letters and the policy statements, many of which have already been incorporated, and we're putting them all into the map guide. So when we look at the review, and as an attorney being on an environmental panel, usually I get pulled in after the firm commitment is issued. We're dealing with special conditions, but there's a lot of really good basic variables to determine, to decide which levels of review, and as an attorney it was interesting to explore these. So first of all, what are the variables to determine levels of review? One is, what HUD program are you looking at? And we'll take that second after the proposed activity, with the reminder that for any projects over 2,500 units, you need to contact HUD immediately. But in terms of the variables that you're looking at, the proposed activity is first. That's your biggest variable. And there's a couple basic definitions that are in this chapter that will guide you in terms of your level of review. The first one being for maintenance. And for the categorically excluded, not subject to laws and authority, we're going to be looking at, does it meet the level and the standard for maintenance?
So we're going to go through all the different programs, and we're going to talk about the different physical activities and the thresholds, but we just wanted to kind of give you the definition of what maintenance is. So it's really revisiting CPD Notice 1602. I've got some handouts here, and it's also an attachment to the app on your phone. So the next couple of slides are actually the tables. So obviously very tiny, nobody can read it, but you should be familiar with this, but it does give you an example of a maintenance activity versus a rehab.
Yeah, some of them would be striping for the wood floors and resealing versus the new wooden floor, in-kind replacements of appliances versus a remodel, repair of cracked or broken sidewalks versus construction of new walkways, and I think we have some additional pictures and examples.
We do. So Bob, I'm going to hand over to you to run through some of the examples. So the first one we have is, the issue is, we have a leaky window versus a replacement of windows. There we go.
Yeah, so this example is fairly simple. What would be maintenance and what would be rehabilitation? And obviously, if you're just repairing a leaky window, that would be maintenance, where replacement of windows, I'm using a plural there, and that can also most likely mean several. That would be an example of rehab. There are situations where routine maintenance may just boil down to replacing a few windows as opposed to repairing them, simply because it may just be more economical to replace. The windows might be old, and the repairs would actually be tedious and might not last very long. It would make more sense to replace them. But if it's not a large number of windows, it would be more of a maintenance item. And if there is a question about the amount of windows, it would be a good idea for a meeting of the minds where the lender should be talking to the HUD office to see how they consider it.
I agree with you.
Bob.
Before you go on to that point, I think you make a good point in terms of if there's a select number of windows that have been leaky, then surely it's safe to assume that the rest of the windows are ultimately going to become leaky within a relatively short period of time. So then does that trigger your threshold into, replacement of all the windows?
Right. Or you can have a situation where there is a planned gradual replacement of windows.
Right.
And as part of a maintenance project, and they could be simply tapping, reserves for replacement.
Bob, in your opinion, would replacement of window seals categorize as a maintenance or a repair?
I would categorize that as maintenance. I'm not an A&E person. I see somebody raising a hand there. I would categorize replacement of window seals as being maintenance.
So under a 223F, this existing HUD insured deal, would that require a full phase one under that scenario?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think.
Just asking for a friend
Asking for a friend, I like
who
it.
submitted a deal that had to get a phase one because of that.
Well, he's no friend of mine. But anyway, no, I don't think that would trigger a phase one in a situation like that, just replacement of window seals.
Yeah, and I think some of the confusion is from the CPD notice, is it 16-02 or 03?
Yep.
Where it talks about window replacement, but it uses a singular term. And so some people have taken that literally by meaning that if you replace one window, it's maintenance, but if you replace more than one window, it's not.
Okay, what is that CPD notice? Because that's
I think
not
it's
familiar to me.
1602 or 1603.
1602, you got it right.
1602.
1602.
And Michelle handed them out. There's copies on the table.
Okay.
And it's
the
an
links in
attachment.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
glad you brought that up because I was going to ask that because
Okay, I want to pass
Jesse
that
and I
on.
have a recent experience with that, don't we?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something we can bring up with Kathy and Rick, and we can report back to you guys. Okay, so we're going to move over to the next slide.
Which-
This is,
Paint.
it is paint.
Okay, and the issue here, this is pretty simple. Peeling paint, okay? Sandblast to remove paint, would that be maintenance? The slide says no. Sandblasting is a pretty major activity, and it's preparation to do a major paint job. So if you're getting involved in sandblasting, you're probably painting the whole thing, so that's more of a rehab issue.
But what about if you did one side of a building?
I would have a conversation with the HUD office.
A level of reasonableness, perhaps?
Yeah, it would be.
And if you have
it
another
would be a
method, if you have another method for removing that paint other than sandblasting, you could do that as under maintenance as well.
What kind of methods?
If you did like dry scraping.
Okay.
There's chemical methods, there's dry scraping, there's wet methods with power washing.
And those you would view as maintenance, not repair, correct?
It would depend. I would not want to give a straight answer. It depends on just how much you're removing, and if you're preparing to do this as surface preparation for a major paint job, that may very well get into rehabilitation. But this is where you want to have that conversation with the HUD office. You don't want to make assumptions.
Right.
So, anyway, the next slide. Non-functional kitchen versus a kitchen remodel. When is it maintenance and when is it rehab? Well, a non-functional kitchen would be a kitchen that is missing appliances so that you really can't do anything that you normally would do in a kitchen. I don't think that just a mere replacement of a range oven would qualify as rehab. When I think of rehab with the kitchen, I'm thinking of a major redo, floors, cabinetry, maybe some new electric, as well as new appliances,
So,
sinks,
Bob,
things like that.
what about if we replace the countertop and the sink, but we kept all the cabinet doors, and we perhaps just replaced the handles? How would you look at that?
I would consider that maintenance unless you were doing it to all your units. Then I would probably start wondering, you know, what else is going on too.
But what about if you were doing it in tranches and just kind of phasing it on a turnover basis? That would be more...
I would probably look at that as maintenance. Once again, time for a phone call.
Okay, it's very diplomatic.
You know, you may get a different answer from different people. That's just the nature of the business.
No, fair enough. Do you got
Yeah.
anything to add there, Jesse?
No, but you know, maybe there's a path to having 1602 rewritten to make some clarifications.
Right.
Or provide
good.
better examples and more clear examples.
Yep.
Okay, the next slide is tree falls on a home. Is that maintenance or is that rehab? And it's time to call a lawyer. Anyway, I would call that maintenance unless the damage is so severe. Not far from here, we do have some neighborhoods where there are some very large trees that have practically destroyed, you know, homes when they've collapsed. So this could be also a different answer depending on the situation. But normally, when I think of a tree collapsing on a building, it's usually branches, messing up some siding, smashing a few windows, that kind of thing. And that would be a repair job as opposed to a rehabilitation.
Great, thanks, Bob.
Okay, and I think, is that the last one?
That's you for the moment. You can take a breather.
Okay.
All right, we're going back over to you, Felicia.
Sure. So now that we've looked at some examples of maintenance, the next definition or threshold to consider is substantial rehabilitation. And you're going to find, so typically a sub-rehab will fall into this level of review, assuming that the activities don't exceed this definition. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, sub-rehab, typically you're not building anything new. You're usually rehabbing existing. So typically it falls under the CENT level review, or CEST level review, versus being triggered to the full environmental assessment. But there are occasions where you have both, new construction and rehab. In that case, you'd be triggered to the higher level.
Right. So we have the basic thresholds for activity, and now we're going to look at them vis-a-vis the various programs to just see how they interplay. So with the 223A7, you're always going to be at the CENST, sensed category because of the nature of that administrative program. But Jesse, I know you had some thoughts on that and what happens if you're outside of some routine maintenance.
Yeah, it was more, typically we had issues where you're doing an A7 and you're going green and you're doing an asteroid report. Obviously then you're doing more than what is routine maintenance. And I wanted to ask Bob if would HUD be amenable to expanding the level of environmental review for an A7 if you were doing those kind of repairs?
I don't think A7 is set up for any environmental review that I know of. If there's someone from HUD here who knows the answer for sure, wants to correct me, that'd be great. A7s are really meant for streamline refinance, and we're not supposed to get into anything that would be rehabilitation.
Yeah, I think, you know, when we had conversations with Rick, he specifically was arguing that the A7 is an administrative program, and he felt that it didn't and it shouldn't trigger environmental. But Jesse, I think you make a really valid point.
Yeah, and one other qualifier for that or issue is what about accessibility? When you have accessibility repairs that do trigger it, can you still do it under an A7, or does it have to now come in as an F?
I think that would be a call that would be made on a case-by-case basis. It would depend on how much work was required for the accessibility to be complied with.
So then just a reminder also under the A7, so it will not trigger your environmental review, but you do still need to do a review for flood insurance because the floodplains do change over time.
That's true.
And then moving on to the 223F program. So you have two levels of review here. one can be, we're seeing a lot of A7s that are being refinanced, or excuse me, we're seeing a lot of existing loans being refinanced with the 223F program, but are really could, technically have the maintenance repairs that we would see under an A7. In that case, then it would stay under the CENST, CENST level of review, but if it rises to the level above the routine maintenance, then it's going to fall into the CEST category and trigger the higher review. And is it possible to even break further out of that threshold, Jesse, do you think, to get into the EA?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're doing a heavy F and you're building a new ancillary building, then you may be triggered into the full environmental assessment.
Yeah, we've done that, adding on a clubhouse, and it ends up triggering. Okay, so we're going to move on
Anytime
to
you
the
have
next
that
slide.
ground disturbance, you got to go to the higher level because you got to look for endangered species and all the other agencies.
All right, moving on to 221D4s.
Okay, that's me. And 224-1D4 is universally all your requirements and environmental assessment. Because, with the new construction, obviously you're breaking ground. With substantial rehabilitation, you're doing enough work to the project that would trigger the environmental assessment. Also covered here is Section 241A, and this is also treated as new construction, and an environmental assessment would be required. About the only time that might not be required is if the 241A was being used to replace equipment, and that would be typically in a 232 project, major movables. That would be the only time I would think an exception would be made.
And Rick was saying, thinking about doing a sub-rehab, if you kind of feel, again, a level of reasonableness that you are making significant changes, that it warrants having a market study, or, you are adding additional units, then it's more than likely going to be, triggering an EA.
For sure.
Sorry, Bob?
Sure.
So I've worked on a couple of 241A, and those are considered new construction, and I think you've also had that same approach as well.
Yeah, typically you're adding units to, it's a second phase or third phase to a property, so you're disturbing the ground, and therefore you trigger the higher level review.
And to me, it makes sense because if you're doing a 241A, it has a new FHA number. It's a new loan. It's a new product. So an environmental assessment does seem to make sense. All right, Felicia, do you want to run us through your top tips of the day?
Yeah, as we were discussing all these various levels of review, one of the things that Rick really wanted to emphasize is that he indicated that the default by HUD for the review level is going to be at the higher level. So it's incumbent upon the lenders with the reviewers to clearly document the activities, that if you're trying to argue for reasonableness at a lower level, you want to make sure that you adequately and clearly complete the project summary and heroes. And if it's of a benefit, to refer to the CPD notice and the check the tables, because it really does give you a lot of good information.
Great, thanks, Felicia. Okay, so the next couple of slides, we're not going to go in too deep. Obviously, flood insurance and floodplains, we could be talking about it forever, but we're talking about, actual versus proposed when we go through these next slides. So I'm going to jump over to you, Jesse, in terms of floodplains.
All right, so the one of the changes they had in the floodplain was they finally adopted in the revised map guide is they adopted the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, FFRMS, that was issued in 2016 as a proposed rule. They've adopted that for new construction, so you have to be 2 feet above base flood elevation versus the 1 foot. And obviously there's been a lot of flooding and other incidents over the past 4 years. So it kind of makes sense that they're wrapping that into the map guide. Again, it's still a draft version. But
sorry, Jesse, do you see any issues with it?
no, it's just going to obviously add cost to your construction project, building the property up 2 feet.
Again, Rick and Kathy wanted to kind of express that, from HUD's perspective, they're just seeing simply a lot of projects coming in through their pipeline which has been negatively impacted by floods, and it's just a nature of the beast, and it's just something that we all need to consider going forward. Okay, Bob, I'm going to jump over to you again. We're going to talk about floodplains, incidental floodplain exception. Is there any changes on that?
No, 24 CFR 55.1 prohibits any HUD action other than functionally dependent use in a floodway unless an exception applies. I won't go through all that, but essentially, if whatever you're doing is going to interfere with the floodway, you're going to have to address that issue.
So it's really no improvements in the floodplain.
Yeah.
Jesse, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, basically, so you can't have any improvements in the floodplain, and if you have a floodway on your property, you can't have any improvements in the floodplain or floodway.
All right, so we're moving on to flood insurance, floodplains and wetlands. So Jesse, you've got a couple of slides here with some examples. Would you mind going through those with us?
Yeah, these, just trying to break it out more so you have some clear picture. I mean, this first example is basically you have a small portion of the property that's a floodplain that's incidental, or floodway that's incidental. Actually, it's floodway, sorry. I was looking at the wrong picture. Incidental, therefore, there's no improvements in it, and there's no improvements in the flood zone. Therefore, that project may move forward. If you had, a flood zone that clipped a building or a parking lot or any other improvement, it would not be able to. So,
but it has to make sure that it meets all those requirements, so it's...
and a lot of times we run into floodway issues. We always, from our standpoint on the environmental side, we're saying just carve out the floodway, which then leads to Felicia. Is that an easy thing to do?
I add value on
issues?
the panel, right? So we get these, we'll get these deals that will come in where they just want to resolve this issue by carving off a parcel. And one of the things that you need to be, aware of is that you can't just always just carve off and get a surveyor to come out, carve off a parcel and transfer it to an affiliate. In many instances, you need to go through a subdivision process. You might have to get replatted. They're all time consuming. And in other instances, you may be dealing with a landlocked parcel which you can't transfer out. You'd have to actually make arrangements to transfer it to an adjacent landowner, which sometimes can be problematic. We had one deal where we were trying to transfer it out, and it was to a homeowners association, and they had to have all kinds of meetings. So those are things to consider when you use that to resolve the issue.
So top tip, consult your consultant
with your lawyer
early.
first.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next slide.
Next slide is scenario 2. You've got a building that's in the flood zone, AE, or 100 year, and there's a floodway on the property. That's dead as far as HUD's concerned. You're not doing that deal.
That's it, drop dead.
Nothing. We actually have a project right now we're working on that's an A7 that was built by HUD, and the floodplain changed, and now there's an improvement in the floodplain, and there's a incidental portion of a floodway. And they are having to keep it as an A7 because HUD cannot do it as a 223F. So they cannot do any repairs to the property beyond maintenance. So beware, this issue will pop up because of the flood zones changing. And beware on those easy A7 deals that you're not going to be able to do any repairs if you have an issue like this, and you're going to have to go through a lot of discussions with HUD on working through it. Not that I'm aware of. Not when you have the floodway and the floodplain. That's the double X. If it's just floodplain, yes, you might be able to go that approach, but not with the floodway and floodplain. Because flood-proofing it would be a repair and not a maintenance activity.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next scenario 3.
All right, and the third example is scenario 3 is you've got a building not in the floodplain, but there is a 100-year floodplain on the site, and that project may proceed no problem. As long as there's no improvements, you don't have to get flood insurance or anything else.
Well, I guess it would depend on what it is you're proposing to do, right?
Are you cutting out the floodway? But if the floodway is on the property, I don't think they're going to do it. 'Cause if a 241A would require a full environmental, and you would uncover that issue, and they would not do it if you have improvements in the flood zone and floodway on the property.
What do you think, Paul?
I would say yes.
Or by canoe?
I'm not going to say that, but I would say yes. If we wanted to, pursue that further, we'd have to go up the chain of command. We could do that, but just let me know.
Okay, so that was scenario number 3. And now we're going to go over to Bruce, who's been very quiet. This is Bruce, in case anyone's forgotten. Bruce, right, okay then. So we're going to talk about phase 2s. This is another topical issue, contamination. So, where a phase 2 environmental assessment has identified contamination to a property that is above the LSTF residential unrestricted criteria, what are the HUD map guide requirements to meet this environmental responsibility?
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So obviously this is a topic nobody wants to talk about because we don't want to see it happen, but it does occur. So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about what's the current requirements and then what are some of the proposed changes that I think are going to be beneficial. Currently, the remediation plans are required. If anytime in your phase 2 you find a contaminant that's above the state requirements criteria for residential or unrestricted use.
Can everyone hear Bruce?
I'm sorry?
Can everyone hear Bruce?
Y'all hear me? Better? Okay.
Okay.
You're not all asleep now, are you? Or is it, are you awake? Okay. All right. So you got to develop a remediation plan. That's the first part, what HUD requires. That plan consists of a site characterization and what the plan is for remediation. Sometimes it's called a remediation action plan or corrective action plan, but you have to put together this plan of what you plan to do. As far as you might be complete remediation or incomplete remediation. And I'll go over these couple in a slide here in a minute. Once the plan has been prepared, you needed to have it approved by the state agency, and that plan then would be submitted to HUD. And at the end of it, HUD wants to see a no further action letter or a certificate of completion or whatever that state calls it. But it's got to be some type of a letter that confirms that the remediation's been completed to the satisfaction of the agency.
So Bruce, I have a quick question. When you send it into HUD, what do they do with it?
I'm sorry, it's
a procedure, a review?
Yeah, well, it's submitted with all the other documents, right, together. So you want to have this all complete by when you submit your documents.
Okay.
Okay. Now, one of the proposed changes here, so like I said before, it's submitted, you got to do the plan, remediation plan, do the site characterization, and decide how you're going to clean it up. There's a proposed change that if you find a contamination in the phase 2, that you should submit it directly to the state agency, its appropriate agency, for them to determine whether additional work needs to be done. That's a little bit of a change from before where we're going through all this work and then submitting it to the agency. So you would submit the phase 2, and then they would tell you what needs to be done from there. As a consultant's view, I like, when we do the phase 2, to do it efficiently enough and collect enough information so that if something does show up, you have a lot of data you can give to the state, and they can make a better decision quicker. Now, a lot of times they may not make a ruling on that. They may say you need to enter into the cleanup program or brownfield program so they can further evaluate that site. If that's the case, if you have to apply into the program, currently a complete site characterization is required by the HUD map guide. And what that means is the entire site needs to be assessed. That's all soil, groundwater, and soil vapor has to be assessed. You got to assess the nature of the contamination, what it is, what type of contaminant, whether it be petroleum, metals, or VOCs or something of that nature. And also the source area, where did it come from? Those things have to be all identified so that you can properly characterize the site. And the standards that you apply to these investigations, your results would have to be applicable with the local state authorities.
Bruce, I got a question, just to interrupt for a second.
Yes.
On the site characterization, say your site is only a portion of a larger development.
Yes, that's,
but you know the contamination may be partly from your site, but partly off-site. How would you have to do your site characterization?
if it's partially off-site as well? Yeah, well, you have to identify the extent of the contamination completely. You have to do it on, to make sure that if it's coming from off-site, you gotta kind of, for the site characterization, you gotta kind of draw a picture. You gotta determine the vertical extent up and down, the lateral extent, sideways. Is there any vapor concerns? At the end of that characterization, you have to know the full extent of that impact and any exposure routes, any impact to maybe groundwater wells or anything that's nearby. That all has to be known before you can actually come up with a work plan.
So Bruce, in your experience when you're dealing with like a master planned development site and you're talking about looking at the bigger picture,
Yep.
and you're looking at a map and you've got your site, you've got a shared access, and then you might have a second phase at a later date, might not necessarily be within the direct ownership at that point of time. It might be like a sister. I mean, and then you might have another parcel of land that's not part of the ownership or owned by some similar key principles, but somebody completely separate. How does that start to kind of evolve, and what kind of considerations are you looking at, or is that just a massive question?
That's a massive question. So, it's a,
Because it's very complicated.
right.
My God, you could spend a fortune.
You can.
Right, and it could last for a really long time. I mean, we've done a couple of applications, and trying to coordinate exactly the extent of the site characterization is what is the frustrating component. Right.
So obviously this is something we would investigate during the phase 1 phase. We'll do some research ahead of our investigation. So all the data that we do have would be applied to the scope of work that we're going to need to characterize the site. So that it needs to be fully characterized.
And justification, to say
Absolutely.
why you think this is the limit of the site characterization.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Or is that?
You may proceed.
Thank you. All right. So as far as the characterization part, once it's complete, that's going to be included in the remediation plan. That's going to be submitted to the state. Next.
Yep.
Okay. So now, part of that plan, you got to come up with how are we going to remediate the site? Obviously the most conservative and the best way for the risk of the low risk or liability to HUD would be to get rid of the contamination completely. And that means that once the remediation plan is completed, as we propose, that all the contamination's gone below the criteria, and that there's no continuing remediation, no monitoring, no engineering controls or institutional controls on the site. It's gone, it's done. They never need to hear about it again. That's the best way, but that's not always the most feasible way, because as we know, some of these things take months to years. I mean, minimum probably 6 to 9 months to get this through a state program, as if everything goes well. These things could go on for a couple of years. So they allow for, may allow for incomplete removal of the contamination, but there's some things that you need to do. You got to take a risk-based approach to this, to the site. You address all the different receptors that may be impacted. Maybe there's schools next door or residences that the vapor may impact. Drinking water wells, all these things you got to take a look at risk-based wise, and then you come up with your plan. This doesn't get rid of the contamination. It's usually left in place, and then but we address it by engineering controls and institutional controls to limit the exposure for people.
So
and then,
Bruce, can I ask you a quick question? When you're working on these projects, what is HUD's take, or what's your take on HUD's take of the institutional controls? Is it literally letter of the law?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they don't want to see that. They rather not have that happen. But in some cases, it just you can't. It's not feasible. Maybe there's contamination in their existing building that you can't get rid of. So deed restrictions are something that, in conjunction with other remedial actions, would have to be completed. So that is something that they will look at.
And then the O&M plan, is that something that needs to be revisited every couple of years?
If things change, so the O&M plan really talks about how you manage the contamination in place. You know, the options, you may have a sub-slab depressurization system for vapor, or you may put a cap in place if there's metals contamination in the soil. So all those things would need a plan to make sure it continually functions the way it's supposed to. So if things change, you redevelop the parking lot or something like that, then changes in that O&M plan would be required.
And then do you have to go back to HUD?
I would assume so. Yeah.
I got a question on that, Bruce, too. So say you're doing new construction, you've got a contaminated site, and you can't remove it all for some reason or other, and you're putting an O&M in place. Could the radon mitigation or radon design, radon-resistant construction, cover your needs for the contamination?
For vapor?
Because new construction, they have to build radon-resistant construction and have that system in place.
That would have to be looked at by the engineer to come up. Vapor is not exactly the same as radon, but it is a similar type situation or way you take care of it. So it's something that they could probably, for new construction, they could build that into the design.
Bob, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Any thoughts from HUD's perspective on that?
My understanding is that this becomes a big problem if you cannot estimate the cost of remediation and the continuous, when you have to do continuous remediation and monitoring, if that cannot be determined as to how much it will cost and the certainty of it, then the project is most likely going to be a reject.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. It's difficult when you have to manage contamination in place. So you really got to address it well, have it very well defined, and understand what needs to be done to keep it in check. So. All right, any questions? Last one, right?
Okay.
Okay. All right, so at the end of the day, you're going to submit your remediation plan to HUD, and they also would like to see the closure letter, NFA letter from the state prior to the firm commitment. That's ideal. But as we know, sometimes it's just not possible due to the length of time it could take to do that. So HUD could consider that they can approve the remediation plan as long as that plan shows that it's going to be cleaned up and not going to have any issues after that point. They, as Bob just said, they may allow a remediation plan, but they'd have to know the cost of what it would take to operate it afterwards. So those things would have to be identified to HUD if you do the incomplete removal. So, okay, that's all I have right now.
Great. I'm going the wrong way. So I got all excited about contamination. I don't know which direction I'm going in. Okay, Charlie, do you have any questions? Hey, I thought we would. That's
for me? Okay. Okay. There you go. Pass it over there.
Okay, a few questions here. And Bob, you might not be able to answer this, maybe someone else in the audience can, but would HUD reconsider the proposal to require 100% radon testing across the country? I don't know who would.
That I would not dare answer.
I mean, from my perspective as a lender, we as a practice have been doing 100% of the ground floor, just simply because if you end up getting a result coming in that's over your threshold, you then have to go back out and do it again. So it's just a one exercise. I know it's costly, and Rick was saying something that would be really helpful from HUD's perspective is that you kind of give a map and a diagram showing exactly where all the ground units are. You know how you'll have like a building that could be 4 stories, but 2 levels, the first and the second level touches the ground, which I thought was a good point. It seems very obvious, but obviously not to everyone. What about you, Jesse? Any thoughts on that?
I would agree with that. I think the 100% pays off for Zone 1, obviously. I mean, Zone 1, you're going to get a hit most likely, so that's not a problem. Zone 2, is it worth the risk? Because then it does slow down your refinance process to have to go back and do 100% after you already did 25, and you're spending more money and more time, and the rates are going up, whatever else. So I think Zones 1 and 2, I think we can all deal with it. I think the Zone 3 is the biggest question, and I would hope HUD would possibly allow a deviation of the 25% for Zone 3.
And I think Rick's thought was the radon maps are just simply so ambiguous that they are finding from their office, such a high threshold where the results, once the testing has been kind of clarified, they are coming in high. So I think they've just taken this stance of we'll do 100%.
So on a new construction deal where you have the CC 100 soil mitigation done under the building, if it's in the Zone 3 area, would maybe that be a good candidate to do just 25%? You have, ventilation under the building and a low radon area combined. So it seems like very little chance.
Is this question for post-construction testing the first time after you
Yes.
build it?
Yes.
I think that's directly from ARST. I don't know if that HUD has any flexibility on that one. I think that's straight from ARST that you have to do 100% post-construction. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, then we have a couple of questions about asbestos, and so clarification, will the proposed asbestos policy really require screening be performed on a property built in the past 5 to 10 years? And if no end date on asbestos, does that mean testing required even on recently constructed projects?
Right now, yes. The way it's written currently, yes. A baseline survey is required for every project. And then if you're doing rehab or heavy F, then you're doing the pre-construction, pre-demolition survey, which is a lot more expensive. So unfortunately, that was why I brought that issue up, because they need to put some kind of date in there. I mean, having it open-ended is too far. I agree that the 78 is probably a little early, but, go with the Freddie Mac and go with 89.
Okay, and then another question, when are the proposed changes to Chapter 9 expected to be incorporated in the map guide? I'm assuming that they'll just come out at the same time when the map guide's published in September.
I'm not sure, and I would refer that question most likely to Tom Bernasiak if he was still here. I don't see him now.
So I guess what about the SHPO kind of proposals? How is that going to get implemented? Do you need to kind of go to every single state agency, get their permission, and then incorporate that into the map guide?
That I'm not sure of. There is precedent for Chapter 9 to be released separately. It was a number of years ago they released Chapter 9 separately, but I don't know what the intention is right now.
Okay, we have a question in the middle. Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification.
Per discussions I've had with Tom Bernasiak, is the entire map guide is going to be published together. They're not going to release it chapter by chapter.
And then just on that as well, another question, why would HUD require SHPO review for interior modifications that do not affect the exterior envelope of the buildings?
Well, with historically significant structures that are already existing, there may be interior elements review by the local SHPO, I imagine.
Is this on? On our ability for us to ask for the SHPO, that does not extend to the tribes. They made that clear out at Craft for people to be aware of.
One other note on the
They
Section
cannot
106.
regulatory-wise.
The Section 106, we have a whole division of EBL that does telecom, and they said the FCC adopted the 106 full consultation back in the 90s, so we're already 15 years behind them, and they're not surprised that it's taking place. And it is going to require a lot of consultants to go hire archaeological historians to be able to review these new construction projects in certain states. So be prepared, the costs are going to go up for that, because it is a rather extensive review that we have to do up front, and then you make a determination and submit it to SHPO.
Another question, so currently the map guide discourages purchase or refi if the lowest floor ingress egress are more than 12 inches below the 100-year floodplain, eliminating the 12-inch qualifier. If the qualifier is eliminated, what proposed actions warranted if parking areas or ingress, egress are below the base flood elevation? Any flexibility?
I don't think there would be, but I would want to check further.
Any more questions? Any from the audience? I think we're all eager for a cocktail.
Everybody's thirsty.
Mine's a gin and tonic.
Reminder to fill out your session feedback for the session in the app. It's very helpful for us to improve conferences year to year. So, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Bob, for
Thank you,
stepping
everyone.
up. He only found out last night that he
Michelle.
was joining us. Thank you.